In 1899, a Chinese scholar examining ancient oracle bones made a discovery that would challenge everything we thought we knew about human civilization. Carved into tortoise shells over 3,000 years old were symbols, descriptions of beings who descended from the heavens, who taught humanity the arts of writing, agriculture, and astronomy. For over a century, Western researchers focused exclusively on the Sumerian tablets and their accounts of the Anunnaki. But halfway across the world, buried in forgotten archives and dismissed by mainstream archaeology, Chinese texts tell remarkably similar stories. Tonight, we journey into the shadows of history, where East meets ancient Mesopotamia, and where the truth about humanity's oldest mystery may finally be revealed. These are the Eastern tablets no one talks about. Imagine yourself standing on the ancient walls of Xi'an as the sun sets and the city transforms before your eyes. The neon lights flicker to life across the skyline, painting the modern towers in shades of electric blue and vivid pink, while below you, the stones that have stood for centuries grow cool in the evening air. This is a city of layers, a place where the ultra-modern and the impossibly ancient exist in the same breath, where businessmen in tailored suits walk past gates that once welcomed emperors, and where beneath every construction site there is the possibility of discovering something that will rewrite everything we thought we understood. The stars begin to emerge above, the same stars that ancient astronomers charted thousands of years ago, and somewhere in the distance, a temple bell sounds its evening call, a sound that has echoed across this land for millennia. China holds within its borders a written history that stretches back more than 3,500 years, longer than nearly any civilization on Earth. And yet, so much of what lies buried in its archives remains unknown to the wider world. We speak of ancient Egypt and marvel at its mysteries. We study the tablets of Mesopotamia and wonder at their strange accounts of gods and creation. But here, in the East, an equally ancient civilization was recording its own encounters with the divine, its own memories of beings who descended from the heavens. And for reasons we will explore tonight, these records have remained largely in shadow. There exists within the study of the ancient world a concept that some researchers call forbidden archaeology, a term that describes discoveries and interpretations that do not fit comfortably within the accepted narrative of human history. These are not necessarily fraudulent claims or sensationalist fantasies, but rather evidence and accounts that challenge the neat timeline we have constructed, that suggest our past may be stranger and more connected than mainstream scholarship allows. In China, such evidence exists in abundance, waiting in museum archives, in temples, in academic journals that have never been translated into Western languages. And perhaps the most remarkable of all these sources are the oracle bones of Yinchu, inscribed fragments of shell and bone that carry messages from a world that officially should not have existed. The messages that speak of heaven opening and beings descending, and knowledge being given to humanity from somewhere beyond the sky. Tonight, we begin a journey into the spaces between what we are told and what the evidence actually shows. A journey that will take us from the scholars' quarters of 19th century Beijing to the buried treasures of Sanxingdui, from ancient texts that have waited millennia to be read with fresh eyes, to artifacts that seem to depict beings unlike any human population known to archaeology. this is not a journey toward easy answers or comfortable conclusions. It is an exploration of mystery, an invitation to wonder, and perhaps, if we follow the evidence with open hearts and curious minds, a glimpse at a chapter of human history that has been waiting far too long to be told. The year was 1899, and in Beijing, a scholar named Wang Yirong was suffering from malaria. Like many educated Chinese of his era, he sought treatment through traditional medicine, and his physician prescribed a remedy that included an ingredient known as longu, or dragon bones. These fragments were believed to be the fossilized remains of ancient dragons, ground into powder and consumed for their supposed healing properties. They were sold in apothecary shops throughout China, unremarkable items that had been part of traditional medicine for centuries. But Wang Yirong was not an ordinary patient. He was a chancellor of the Imperial Academy and an expert in ancient Chinese writing, and when he examined the dragon bones before they could be ground to powder, he noticed something extraordinary. Carved into the surface of these bones were symbols, faint but unmistakable marks that he recognized as an ancient form of Chinese script. In that moment, holding those inscribed fragments in his trembling hands, Wang Yirong became the first modern scholar to identify the oracle bones of the Shang dynasty. And he could not have known that this discovery would eventually lead researchers down paths that mainstream archaeology still hesitates to follow. The oracle bones were not dragon remains at all. They were the plastrons of tortoises and the scapulae of oxen used by the diviners of the Shang dynasty between roughly 1600 and 1046 BCE for a practice that connected the earthly realm with powers beyond. The diviners would carve questions into the bone, apply heat until cracks appeared, and then interpret those cracks as answers from the spirits and deities they sought to consult. After the divination was complete, the question and often the answer would be inscribed permanently into the bone, creating an unintentional archive of Shang dynasty concerns, beliefs, and experiences. Since that first discovery, over 150,000 oracle bone fragments have been unearthed, primarily from the ruins of Yinchu near the modern city of Anyang. These bones represent the earliest substantial body of Chinese writing ever found, and their contents have transformed our understanding of ancient China. Most of the inscriptions concern matters we might expect from a Bronze Age civilization. There are questions about the harvest, about the weather, about the outcome of military campaigns and the health of the royal family. There are records of offerings made to ancestors and inquiries about the proper timing for rituals. But scattered among these mundane concerns are inscriptions of a different character entirely, references to Dai, the supreme deity who dwelt in heaven and who held power over all things below. The concept of Dai in Shang dynasty religion has puzzled scholars for generations. Unlike later Chinese religious traditions where heaven was understood as an impersonal cosmic force, the Dai of the oracle bones appears to be a personal being, or perhaps a council of beings who actively communicated with and intervened in human affairs. The oracle bones describe Dai sending down rain, commanding the winds, approving or disapproving of the king's actions, and perhaps most intriguingly, sending down what can only be translated as knowledge or instruction to those below. Some inscriptions speak of beings descending from the realm of Dai, arriving in the human world to deliver messages or to teach. Scholars have traditionally interpreted these references as purely religious metaphor, as the symbolic language of an early civilization attempting to explain natural phenomena through supernatural means. But when we place these inscriptions alongside similar accounts from the other great Bronze Age civilization that flourished at exactly the same time, a more complex picture begins to emerge. The Shang dynasty and the high civilization of ancient Sumer were contemporaries, both reaching their peaks in the second millennium BCE, both emerging with remarkable suddenness and sophistication, both developing elaborate systems of writing, both recording encounters with beings from beyond the earthly realm. The bones speak of heaven opening, of presences descending, of knowledge being given. For a century, scholars have translated these words with skill and precision. Far fewer have paused to ask what they actually mean. Half a world away from the rice paddies and mulberry groves of ancient China, in the arid lands between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, another civilization was carving its own accounts into clay. The Sumerians, who built the first cities and invented the first writing system, left behind thousands of tablets that describe their origins, their beliefs, and their relationship with beings they called the Anunnaki. The name itself carries meaning. In the Sumerian language, and refers to heaven or the sky, and the full term Anunnaki is often translated as those who from heaven to earth came, or those of royal blood who descended. According to the tablets, these beings arrived in the distant past, established themselves in the lands of Sumer, and played a direct role in the creation and development of human civilization. The Sumerian accounts describe a hierarchy among the Anunnaki, with the supreme figure Anu presiding from his celestial realm, while his children Enlil and Enki took more active roles in earthly affairs. Enlil was the lord of the command, the enforcer of divine decrees, while Enki was the god of wisdom and water, the friend of humanity who taught the arts of civilization and who intervened to protect humans when other Anunnaki sought their destruction. The tablets describe these beings, granting humanity the gifts of agriculture, of writing, of mathematics, of astronomy, of medicine, of laws and governance. They describe the Anunnaki creating humans to serve as workers, and they describe a complex relationship between gods and mortals that spanned generations before the Anunnaki eventually withdrew from direct involvement in human affairs. In the 20th century, the researcher Zecharia Sitchin proposed a controversial interpretation of these tablets, suggesting that the Anunnaki were not gods in the traditional spiritual sense, but rather visitors from another world who used advanced technology to interact with ancient humans. His work has been criticized by mainstream scholars for numerous translation errors and speculative leaps, and it would be irresponsible to present his conclusions as established fact, but his central observation remains provocative regardless of one's views on his specific claims. The Sumerians were remarkably consistent in describing the Anunnaki as physical beings who came from a physical place, who ate and drank and quarreled among themselves, who arrived and eventually departed. Whether we interpret this as mythology, as misunderstood natural phenomena, as garbled memories of a lost human civilization, or as something stranger still, the tablets themselves present a coherent narrative that deserves serious consideration. What Sitchin and most other researchers have overlooked, however, is that Sumer was not alone in recording such accounts. The academic study of ancient civilizations has long been divided into separate disciplines with little communication between them. Scholars of Mesopotamia rarely read Chinese, and sinologists rarely study cuneiform. Archaeological journals are published in dozens of languages and distributed through networks that seldom overlap. The result is a fragmented understanding of the ancient world, one in which each civilization is studied in isolation, even when the evidence suggests profound connections between them. The silence from the East regarding Anunnaki parallels is not because China lacks relevant texts. It is because almost no one working in the field of ancient astronaut research has possessed the linguistic tools to access them, and almost no one working in Chinese studies has thought to look for these connections. The walls between academic disciplines have created blind spots that persist to this day, and in those blind spots lie discoveries waiting to be made. Tonight, we will examine several Chinese texts that deserve far more attention than they have received. The bamboo annals, discovered in a tomb sealed for 6 centuries, present a history of ancient China that contradicts the official record and describes rulers with distinctly non-human characteristics. The classic of mountains and seas catalogues a world of strange geography and stranger beings, including detailed accounts of entities who traveled between heaven and earth. The Book of Documents preserves traditions about the mandate of heaven that in their original form may have described something far more literal than later Confucian scholars were comfortable admitting. And the archaeological evidence, particularly from the astonishing site of Sanxingdui, presents artifacts that seem to depict beings unlike any known human population, beings with enormous protruding eyes and features that appear almost deliberately non-human. We will also examine the oral traditions and folk memories that have persisted in Chinese culture for millennia. Stories of culture heroes who descended from the sky, of dragons that were not mere beasts, but intelligent beings who served as vehicles or companions for heavenly visitors, of a golden age when gods walked among humans and shared their wisdom freely. These traditions have been dismissed as mere mythology, but mythology does not emerge from nothing. Behind every persistent legend lies some seed of experience, some memory that was important enough to preserve across countless generations, even as its original meaning faded into symbol and story. The approach we will take in this exploration is one of honest curiosity rather than rigid certainty. We are not here to prove that ancient astronauts definitely visited both China and Mesopotamia, nor are we here to dismiss the possibility out of hand. We are here to look at evidence that has been overlooked, to ask questions that have gone unasked, and to follow the thread of inquiry wherever it leads. The ancient Chinese were meticulous record keepers who valued history and tradition above almost all else. If something remarkable happened in their distant past, they would have recorded it, and the evidence suggests that they did. In the pages that follow, pages that have waited millennia to be read with fresh eyes, we may find that the Anunnaki left traces not only in the clay tablets of Sumer, but across the entire ancient world. We may find that the beings who taught humanity the arts of civilization did not limit their activities to a single region, but appeared wherever humans were ready to receive their instruction. And we may find that the great silence from the East is not an absence of evidence, but simply an invitation that has been waiting with infinite patience for someone finally to accept. The hour grows late, The temple bells have faded into silence, and the stars wheel overhead in their eternal patterns. Let us turn the page together, and let us see what the ancient Chinese discovered about the beings who came from heaven. In the year 281 of the Common Era, in the kingdom of Wei, during the turbulent period known as the Jin dynasty, a group of tomb robbers broke into an ancient burial mound in a region called Ji that had been sealed for nearly 6 centuries. And what they discovered inside would challenge everything. Scholars thought they knew about Chinese history, for there, among the bones and burial goods, lay bundles of bamboo strips covered in archaic script. And these strips contained texts that had been deliberately hidden away. Texts that told a different story of China's origins than the one that had been passed down through official channels, and the tomb robbers had no interest in bamboo strips. Of course, they wanted gold and jade, but local authorities recovered the bundles before they could be scattered or destroyed. And when scholars began the painstaking work of reassembling and translating these ancient documents, they found themselves reading what we now call the Bamboo Annals, a chronicle that had been buried quite literally by history. And when these annals emerged from that ancient tomb, they brought with them a version of the past that powerful forces had tried to erase, because the Bamboo Annals contradicted the orthodox histories that had been carefully curated by successive dynasties. And they spoke of an age before human emperors, an age when beings of tremendous power walked the earth, beings who came from somewhere else entirely. And the text describes this primordial era as the time of the 3 sovereigns and the 5 emperors, mythological figures who preceded the first human dynasties by countless generations. And the 3 sovereigns were not human in any conventional sense. They were Fuxi and Nuwa, and Shenong beings possessed of supernatural attributes and heavenly origins, beings who descended to Earth to establish the very foundations of civilization. And when we examine their descriptions closely, we begin to see patterns that echo across continents, patterns that mirror what the Sumerian tablets tell us about the Anunnaki. For both traditions describe a small group of supreme beings who arrived from the celestial realm, and both traditions credit these beings with teaching humanity the essential arts of civilization. And both traditions suggest that these beings were related to one another, forming a kind of divine family or hierarchy that governed humanity's earliest development. And let us consider Fuxi in particular, because his story contains remarkable parallels to what we know of the Mesopotamian god Enki, also called Ea for Fuxi, is credited with nothing less than the creation of writing itself, and he is said to have now taught humanity the arts of fishing and hunting and trapping, and he established the fundamental principles of social order, including the institution of marriage. And he is credited with creating the 8 trigrams of the I Ching, that profound system of divination and cosmic understanding that has guided Chinese thought for millennia. And when we turn to the Sumerian records, we find Enki credited with almost identical achievements. For Enki was the god of wisdom and knowledge, and he was the one who gave humanity the me, those divine decrees that contained all the arts of civilization. And Enki taught humans writing and agriculture and the crafts. And like Fuxi, he was associated with water and with the serpent. And this brings us to perhaps the most striking parallel of all, because ancient Chinese art consistently depicts Fuxi with a serpentine. lower body, showing him as a being whose form was part human and part snake. And Nuwa, his consort and sometimes described as his sister, is depicted the same way. And when we look at Sumerian art, we find serpent imagery woven throughout their depictions of divine beings, and the serpent was sacred to Enki. In particular, associated with wisdom and with the knowledge of life and death. And across both traditions, the serpent represents not evil, as later cultures would have it, but knowledge and transformation and divine power. And Nuwa herself presents a fascinating case for study, because the ancient texts tell us that she repaired the heavens, and consider what that phrase actually means. For it suggests not merely mythological drama, but some kind of technological or cosmological intervention. And the texts describe how the sky was broken, how the pillars that held up heaven had collapsed, and Nuwa gathered colored stones and melted them to patch the holes in the sky, and she cut off the legs of a giant turtle to create new pillars, and she burned reeds to create ash that would stop the flooding waters. And this reads not as primitive mythology, but as a garbled account of tremendous technological feats preserved in the only language available to those who witnessed them or heard the stories passed down through generations. And then there is Shang, the divine farmer, the third of the three sovereigns. And his very name tells us his function, for he taught humanity the arts of agriculture, and he is credited with inventing the plough and with teaching people to clear land and plant crops. And he tested hundreds of plants to discover which were medicinal and which were poisonous. And in doing so, now he established the foundations of Chinese medicine. And when we look to Mesopotamia, we find that agricultural knowledge was likewise attributed to divine beings. And the god Enlil was particularly associated with the plough and with the fertility of the earth. And both traditions agree that agriculture was not something humans figured out on their own, but something that was given to them, taught to them by beings who came from elsewhere. And the bamboo annals place these three sovereigns at the very beginning of Chinese civilization, followed by the 5 emperors who were their successors and intermediaries between the fully divine sovereigns and the human dynasties that would follow. And this hierarchical structure mirrors exactly what we find in the Sumerian records, where the great gods, the Anunnaki council, were followed by lesser divine beings, and demigods who served as bridges between heaven and earth. And Fuxi descended from heaven, bringing with him the secrets of writing and mathematics and cosmic understanding, and Insuma Enki did the same. And 2 cultures separated by vast distances and seemingly without contact. Both recorded the same story, and the bamboo annals were hidden away for 6 centuries because they told this story too clearly, because they contradicted the more rationalized histories that later dynasties preferred. And when we read them today, we must ask what else has been hidden, and what other texts lie buried waiting to add their voices to this chorus. And now we turn to another ancient Chinese text, one that has puzzled scholars for centuries with its strange catalogues and impossible geographies. And this is the Sanxingdui, the classic of mountains and seas, a text unlike any other in Chinese literature, and the core portions of this text date from roughly the 4th to the 1st century before the Common Era. But scholars believe it records traditions far older than that oral histories and geographical knowledge passed down from a time we can barely imagine. And the Sanxingdui reads like a traveler's guide to a world we no longer recognize, or perhaps a world we have been taught to forget, for it describes regions and mountains and seas populated by creatures and beings that defy ordinary explanation. And it catalogues these wonders with systematic precision, recording the appearance and attributes and locations of hundreds of entities, as if the author were compiling a reference guide for travelers who might venture into these strange territories. And among its most significant passages are the descriptions of the heavenly realm and the beings who traveled between heaven and earth, and at the center of this cosmic geography stands Kunlun Mountain, the sacred peak that served as the axis mundi, the pillar connecting earth to heaven. And Kunlun was not merely a physical mountain, though it may have corresponded to a real peak in western China, but was primarily a cosmic location, the place where heaven and earth met, where divine beings dwelt, and where chosen mortals might ascend to receive wisdom and immortality. And when we look to Mesopotamia, we find the exact same concept in the cosmic mountain where the gods resided, and the ziggurat temples were built to replicate this cosmic mountain, creating artificial sacred peaks where humans might approach the divine. And both traditions describe the same essential cosmology, a universe with heaven above, and the earth below, connected by a sacred mountain or pillar where communication between realms was possible. And the Shanhai Jing describes the beings who dwelt on and around Kunlun with fascinating detail. And among the most important of these is the Queen Mother of the West, known as Shi Wangmu, a powerful female deity who ruled over a heavenly palace on the mountain. And she is described as controlling access to the elixir of immortality. And she commands an entourage of divine attendants. And she receives visitors from the mortal world whom she may choose to bless with eternal life. And when we compare her to the Mesopotamian goddess Inanna, also known as Ishtar, we find striking parallels, for Inanna too was a powerful female deity associated with both heaven and earth. And she too controlled access to divine powers. And she too was depicted as commanding a celestial court, and both goddesses are associated with the planet Venus, with death and resurrection, and with the boundaries between mortal and immortal realms. And the Shanhai Jing describes beings who descended on clouds and returned to the stars. Beings who came from heaven to interact with humanity and then departed back to their celestial home. And when the text describes these beings, it often notes their unusual physical characteristics, their strange appearances and hybrid forms, and we find descriptions of beings with multiple heads or faces, beings with wings, beings whose forms combined human and animal characteristics. And these descriptions parallel, remarkably, the hybrid creatures that populate Mesopotamian art. The human-headed bulls, the winged figures, the beings that seem to combine multiple forms into single entities, and the dragon. Kings who appear throughout Chinese mythology are particularly significant, for they are associated with wisdom and celestial origin, and they rule over watery domains, from palaces beneath the seas and lakes, and they possess technologies and treasures beyond human understanding, and they can travel between realms, moving from water to earth to sky with ease. And when the Shanhai Jing speaks of these beings who descended from heaven and brought knowledge and interacted with humans before departing, we must ask honestly whether this is mythology or memory, whether these are stories invented to explain the world or accounts preserved of events that actually occurred. And perhaps the distinction itself is false. Perhaps mythology at its root is memory distorted by time and retelling, but memory nonetheless of encounters so profound they could never be forgotten, only transformed. And now we come to what may be the most significant Chinese text of all, at least for understanding how ancient Chinese understood their relationship to the divine realm. And this is the Shujing, also called the Book of Documents or the Book of History, and it is one of the 5 classics. The foundational texts of Chinese civilization, supposedly compiled or edited by Confucius himself, and the Shujing contains speeches and proclamations and records dating back to the earliest dynasties, and among its most important concepts is the Mandate of Heaven, the Tianming, which provided the philosophical foundation for Chinese political thought for millennia. And the Mandate of Heaven, as later dynasties understood, it was the divine right to rule, the idea that heaven conferred authority on worthy rulers and withdrew it from unworthy ones, and this concept has been interpreted for centuries as a philosophical abstraction, a way of thinking about political legitimacy in cosmic terms. But when we examine the earliest sources, we find something quite different. For the original concept seems to have been far more literal than later philosophers acknowledged, and the Mandate of Heaven was not merely a political concept, but in its original form described actual beings from actual heavens, conferring actual authority on chosen humans. And the texts speak of the bright ancestors who established civilization and who communicated directly with the rulers they chose. And these bright ancestors dwelt in heaven and watched over earthly affairs, and their mandate was not symbolic, but real, a delegation of power from divine beings to human representatives. And this mirrors precisely the Sumerian concept of kingship, which the tablets describe as descending from heaven. And the Sumerian kings were not merely political rulers, but intermediaries between the gods and humanity, chosen and authorized by the Anunnaki to govern on their behalf. And both traditions describe the same relationship between divine beings in heaven and human rulers on earth, with authority flowing downward from the celestial realm. And among the most fascinating figures in these early texts is Huangdi, the Yellow Emperor, who is credited with establishing Chinese civilization in its mature form. And the traditions surrounding Huangdi contain some of the most explicit descriptions of otherworldly technology in Chinese literature. For Huangdi arrived in a dragon of light, a glowing vehicle that descended from the sky. And he brought with him technologies far beyond what humans possessed. And he taught humanity the arts of medicine and metallurgy and silk production and writing and astronomy and warfare. And he unified the tribes and established the patterns of civilization that would endure for thousands of years. And when Huangdi departed this world, he ascended on the same dragon, returning to the stars from whence he came. And the Chinese did not write this as metaphor, and they did not intend it as poetry, and they wrote it as history, as a factual account of their civilization's origins. And when we compare Huangdi's attributes and achievements to descriptions of Anunnaki leaders, we find the same pattern of divine beings arriving with advanced knowledge, establishing civilization, teaching humanity, and eventually departing. And the chariot descriptions in early Chinese texts deserve particular attention, for they describe flying vehicles in terms that suggest something beyond ordinary horse-drawn conveyances. And these celestial chariots or dragon carriages appear repeatedly in the literature, carrying divine beings between heaven and earth. And similar descriptions appear in other ancient traditions. Of course, in the Vimanas of Indian texts, in the Merkaba of Hebrew mysticism, in the flying vehicles described in cultures around the world. And we must acknowledge that later dynasties edited and revised these ancient texts over centuries, and much has been lost and much has been changed. And the burning of books under the first Qin emperor in 213 BCE destroyed countless texts that might have contained even more explicit accounts. And yet enough survives to suggest that the original traditions were more direct about non-human origins than the versions that have come down to us. And scholars have identified sections of the Shujing that appear to be later interpolations, rationalized versions that replaced more fantastical accounts. And the lost sections of these texts may have contained the clearest evidence of all evidence that was deliberately suppressed or simply allowed to fade from memory. And what we have now are fragments, echoes, shadows of a more complete picture. But even these fragments, when read with open eyes, tell a story that resonates across cultures and across millennia, and the mandate of heaven in its original form was not philosophy, but history, not metaphor, but memory of a time when beings from heaven walked among us and chose from among humanity those who would carry forward the work of civilization. And these three great texts, the Bamboo Annals and the Classic of Mountains and Seas and the Book of Documents, form the foundation of our understanding of how ancient Chinese perceived their origins. And together, they paint a picture remarkably consistent with what the Sumerian tablets tell us about the Anunnaki. And together they suggest that the story of beings from heaven is not a local phenomenon, not a Mesopotamian peculiarity, but a global memory preserved independently by civilizations that may or may not have had direct contact with one another. And as we sit with these texts, as we let their voices speak across the millennia, we begin to sense the outline of a truth that has been hiding in plain sight, waiting for us to read with fresh eyes and open minds. In the year 1929, in a quiet corner of Sichuan province, far from the traditional centers of Chinese civilization, a farmer digging a drainage ditch struck something hard beneath the earth. And in that moment, without knowing it, he opened a door to one of the greatest archaeological mysteries the world has ever known. The site would come to be called Sanxingdui, meaning 3-star mounds, and for decades it would sit quietly waiting as scholars focused their attention elsewhere on the familiar territories of the Yellow River Valley, where Chinese civilization was supposed to have begun. But Sanxingdui did not care for supposed origins or comfortable theories. And when major excavations finally began in 1986, what emerged from the ancient soil would shatter everything archaeologists thought they understood about the ancient world. Picture the scene, if you will. As workers carefully brushed away layers of earth that had accumulated over 3,000 years. Their movements slow and deliberate in the warm Sichuan air. And then imagine the moment when the first bronze face emerged from the darkness, a face unlike anything anyone had ever seen in Chinese archaeology, a face that seemed to belong to another world entirely. The figures of Sanxingdui stare at us across millennia with eyes that see something we cannot, and their gaze is directed upward toward the heavens, towards something or somewhere that we can only imagine. These were not the delicate, refined features that characterized traditional Chinese bronze work from the Shang and Zhou dynasties. No, these faces were something else entirely, with enormous protruding eyes that extended outward from the skull like telescopes, or like the eyes of beings accustomed to seeing across vast distances, perhaps even the distances between stars. The noses were prominent and angular, the ears stylized and elongated, and the expressions carried a solemnity that transcended human emotion, as if these figures were remembering something profound, something lost, something that their creators desperately wanted future generations to remember as well. When archaeologists first unearthed these bronze faces, they did not know what to say because the features did not match any known Chinese artistic tradition, and they did not match any human population that scholars had documented, and they seemed to match something else entirely, something that existed only in the realm of mythology, or perhaps in memories too ancient to be called history. The excavations of 1986 yielded treasures beyond imagination, including two massive sacrificial pits filled with bronze figures, jade artifacts, elephant tusks, and gold objects that had been ritually burned and buried as if in farewell to beings who were departing or in memory of beings who had already gone. Among the most stunning discoveries were life-sized bronze statues standing over 8 feet tall with those distinctive otherworldly features and hands positioned as if once holding objects of great importance. Objects that were either never included or that have long since vanished into the mists of time. The gold masks found at Sanxingdui possess an ethereal quality that photographs cannot fully capture, and when you stand before them in the museum in Chengdu, where many are now housed, you feel as though you are looking at portraits, not of humans and not quite of gods, but of something in between, something that walked among our ancestors and left an impression so profound that they devoted their finest craftsmanship to preserving those memories in imperishable metal. Perhaps most remarkable of all was the discovery of the Great Bronze Tree, a massive artifact standing nearly 4 meters tall, depicting a tree with multiple branches adorned with flowers, fruits, birds, and dragons, reaching upward toward heaven in a gesture that seems to connect the earthly realm with something far above. This tree of life motif will become crucially important as our journey continues, because it appears not only here in ancient China, but across the ancient world in Mesopotamia, in Egypt, in the Americas, wherever ancient peoples left records of their origins and their teachers from the sky. The dating of these artifacts places them squarely in the period between 3,000 and 4,800 years ago, which means that the civilization that created Sanxingdui was flourishing at exactly the same time as the High Sumerian civilization in Mesopotamia, and this contemporaneity is not something we can simply dismiss as coincidence when the artifacts themselves show such striking parallels. The bronze working technology displayed at Sanxingdui represents a level of sophistication that appeared seemingly from nowhere, with no clear developmental stages visible in the archaeological record, as if the knowledge to create such works arrived fully formed. A gift perhaps from teachers whose own mastery extended back into depths of time we cannot fathom. No written records have yet been discovered from this civilization, which only deepens the mystery, because here was a culture capable of producing some of the most advanced bronze work in the ancient world. Yet they either did not write or wrote on materials that have not survived, or perhaps their records still wait beneath the Sichuan soil for future archaeologists to discover. The artifacts suggest something that mainstream scholarship has been reluctant to address directly: And that is the possibility that the people of Sanxingdui were not depicting imaginary beings or abstract religious concepts, but were instead preserving with painstaking accuracy the memory of actual beings who looked different from the local human population. Beings who came from elsewhere and whose presence was so significant that remembering their faces became a sacred duty passed down through generations. Let us now move from the excavation pits of Sanxingdui to the quiet halls of museums where these artifacts can be studied side by side with their counterparts from the ancient Near East, and where the parallels between East and West become impossible to ignore. Place a Sumerian cylinder seal beside a Sanxingdui bronze and study them together in the soft museum light, and you will notice things that cannot be explained by coincidence alone. Because both traditions depict beings with unusual features, both show elaborate headdresses and ceremonial regalia, both display symbols of celestial authority, and both include the tree of life reaching toward heaven. The Sumerian seals show the Anunnaki in their divine council seated upon thrones receiving supplication from human worshippers, while attendant beings stand ready with the implements of sacred ritual and the poses, the proportions. The symbolic language all find echoes in the bronze figures from Sichuan, as if two distant civilizations were working from the same reference material or the same memories. The gold work of Sanxingdui employs techniques that parallel Sumerian goldsmithing, including the use of gold foil pressed over bronze cores to create faces of gleaming divine radiance. And while scholars might attribute this to independent invention, the specific applications and the ritual contexts suggest something deeper than parallel development. Consider the crowns and headdresses depicted on the Sanxingdui figures, which show elaborate arrangements of solar and celestial symbols, and compare them to the horned crowns worn by Anunnaki deities in Mesopotamian art, where the horns represented divine status and the right to rule over human affairs. Now, both traditions distinguish clearly between two types of beings, those of larger stature and those of smaller stature, those with divine attributes and those who serve as intermediaries. And this hierarchical representation appears again and again across the ancient world, as if every culture that encountered these beings understood the same organizational structure. The serpent motif winds through both traditions as well, with the great dragons of Chinese mythology, bearing striking resemblances to the serpentine beings depicted in Sumerian texts, and with both cultures associating these creatures with wisdom, with secret knowledge, and with the origins of civilization itself. In Sumer, the precious stone lapis lazuli was considered a material of the gods imported at great expense from the distant mines of Afghanistan and used to adorn temples and sacred objects. And in China, jade served the same purpose, a stone so precious that it was believed to confer immortality and to connect the earthly realm with the celestial powers above. Both materials share that quality of appearing to hold light within them, as if they contain a fragment of heaven itself, and both were worked with extraordinary skill into objects of ritual significance that were then buried with the dead, or placed in sacred contexts where they could serve as bridges between worlds. The craftsmen of Sanxingdui were not depicting imaginary beings born of fever dreams or primitive superstition, because the level of detail, the consistency of representation, and the obvious reverence with which these works were created all point to something more significant and more troubling for conventional history. They were reproducing, with the accuracy of portrait artists, beings they had seen beings. Their ancestors had known beings whose memory was so important that no expense of labor or material was too great to ensure that future generations would remember what they looked like and would understand that they had once walked among us. Now let us turn our attention to another class of artifacts that has long puzzled scholars and that may provide the key to understanding how ancient peoples preserved and transmitted the astronomical knowledge they claim to have received from heavenly teachers. The Bai discs of ancient China are circular jade objects with holes in their centers found in burial sites and ritual contexts across thousands of years of Chinese history. And for generations, scholars assumed they were simply symbols of heaven, or perhaps representations of the sky. But recent research has revealed something far more intriguing. Many of these discs feature patterns of small holes or markings that, when analyzed mathematically, correspond to the positions of stars and constellations, as if the ancient craftsmen were encoding celestial maps into imperishable stone, creating records that could survive millennia and transmit astronomical knowledge to future generations. The jade discs of ancient China are not mere ornaments or simple religious symbols, but are instead star maps frozen in stone showing constellations and stellar positions that ancient humans should not have possessed the technology to determine with such precision. Consider what it means to accurately map the night sky without telescopes, without computers, without the accumulated knowledge of centuries of astronomical observation, and you begin to appreciate that either the ancient Chinese were far more sophisticated than we have assumed, or they received assistance from teachers who already possessed this knowledge. The Sumerians displayed the same remarkable astronomical sophistication, recording the movements of planets, the cycles of the moon, and the positions of stars with an accuracy that would not be matched in Europe until the Renaissance. And, like the Chinese, they attributed this knowledge not to their own genius, but to the Anunnaki who descended from heaven and taught humanity the secrets of the cosmos. At Taosi, in Shaanxi province, archaeologists have uncovered an astronomical observatory dating back 4,300 years, a complex of carefully positioned pillars that allowed ancient observers to track the movements of the sun throughout the year, with extraordinary precision determining solstices and equinoxes, and marking the passage of seasons with an accuracy that suggests deep astronomical understanding. The question that haunts researchers who study Taosi is not whether the ancient Chinese understood astronomy, but rather how they came to understand it so thoroughly at such an early date, when the developmental stages that should have preceded such knowledge are largely absent from the archaeological record. The Chinese zodiac, with its 12 animal signs and its complex system of celestial influences, bears intriguing similarities to the Mesopotamian zodiac, with both systems dividing the heavens into segments, and both attributing profound influence to celestial bodies over human affairs. Both the Chinese and Sumerian civilizations emerged onto the stage of history with ready-made astronomical knowledge already in place, as if this understanding was part of their cultural inheritance, rather than something they developed through centuries of patient observation. When the Sumerians recorded their astronomical knowledge, they credited the Anunnaki with teaching them the movements of the heavens and the meanings of celestial signs. And when the Chinese recorded their astronomical traditions, They credited beings who descended from the heavens, bringing knowledge as a gift to humanity. The knowledge is the same in both traditions, encompassing the movements of planets, the cycles of seasons, the positions of stars, and the mathematical relationships that govern celestial mechanics. And perhaps the source of this knowledge is the same as well. This concept of astronomy as inherited memory rather than independent discovery offers a profound reorientation of how we understand the ancient world, suggesting that the first civilizations did not slowly accumulate knowledge through trial and error, but instead received instruction from teachers who had already mastered these arts. The artifacts speak to us across the millennia in voices that mainstream archaeology has been reluctant to hear, and what they say is revolutionary and troubling and wonderful all at once. They tell us that beings from elsewhere walked among our ancestors, that these beings taught humanity the foundations of civilization, and that cultures as distant as Sumer and Sanxingdui remembered the same teachers, depicted the same faces, and preserved the same astronomical knowledge as sacred inheritance. As sleep begins to soften the edges of consciousness, and the mind drifts into that liminal space between waking and dreaming, perhaps you can feel the weight of these ancient memories, and perhaps you can sense how thin the barrier is between what we think we know and what our ancestors knew for certain when they gazed upon those faces of bronze and gold and understood that they were remembering not myths, but visitors, not legends, but teachers, not imagination, but a history older and stranger and more wonderful than we have dared to believe. Long before the caravans of the Han dynasty carried bolts of shimmering silk westward through mountain passes and across endless desert expanses, there existed older roads and older travelers moving through the spaces between civilizations, carrying with them not merchandise, but something far more precious and enduring. For we must now turn our attention to the evidence that the ancient world was far more connected than conventional history has allowed us to believe. And in this connection, we may find the key to understanding how the same stories of beings from heaven could appear in cultures separated by thousands of miles of harsh terrain and seemingly impassable barriers. The wind still blows across the steppes of Central Asia, much as it did 4,000 years ago, when the first travelers made their way along paths that would later become formalized into what we call the Silk Road. But the evidence now emerging from archaeological sites scattered across this vast region tells us that contact between East and West began far earlier than anyone had previously imagined. And it is in this contact that we may find either the transmission of the Anunnaki accounts from one culture to another, or perhaps even more remarkably confirmation that both cultures were recording the same phenomena, witnessed independently in their own lands in 1934 in the remote Tarim Basin of Western China. Archaeologists began uncovering something that would challenge everything. Scholars thought they knew about ancient population movements, for buried in the dry desert sands, preserved by the arid climate in a state of remarkable completeness, were human remains that should not have been there, the mummies of the Tarim Basin, dating from approximately 1800 BCE to 400 BCE, displayed physical characteristics that were distinctly not East Asian in origin. With their light brown and reddish hair, their elongated faces, and their tall statures. These individuals bore features that would have been more common in ancient Europe or the Near East than in China. And yet, Here they lay thousands of miles from where such populations were supposed to have lived, wrapped in woolen textiles woven with patterns strikingly similar to those found in Bronze Age Europe. The implications were profound and unsettling. For if people with these characteristics were living in Western China nearly 4,000 years ago, then the ancient world possessed networks of movement and contact that predated our earliest records of organized trade by millennia. Genetic studies conducted in recent decades have only deepened this mystery, revealing that these Tarim Basin populations carried DNA markers, linking them to populations across a vast sweep of territory from the Pontic Steppe to the Altai Mountains. The picture that emerges is not one of isolated civilizations developing in splendid separation, but rather a complex web of human movement and interaction stretching across the entirety of the Eurasian landmass. And if people moved, so did their stories, their beliefs, and their memories of the beings they called gods. Consider now what archaeologists have termed the Steppe Highway, a network of interconnected routes that allowed for the movement of people, goods, and ideas across Central Asia, long before any formal trade infrastructure existed. Along these ancient paths, technologies spread with remarkable speed. The development of bronze, working the domestication of the horse, the invention of wheeled vehicles. All of these innovations appear in the archaeological record at dates that suggest rapid transmission across enormous distances rather than slow, independent development. And alongside these physical technologies traveled something equally important: the knowledge systems, the astronomical observations, and the religious beliefs of the peoples who used these routes. We find evidence of this early contact in the most precious materials of the ancient world. For the jade that Chinese civilization valued above all other substances could only be obtained from specific sources in Central Asia, particularly from the region around Khotan, and its presence in Chinese sites dating back to the Neolithic period tells us that trade networks connecting China to the wider world existed from the very dawn of civilization. Similarly, the lapis lazuli that Sumerian artisans prized so highly originated in the mountains of what is now Afghanistan, and its appearance in both Mesopotamian and early Chinese contexts suggests that a network of exchange connected these distant regions across the forbidding terrain that lay between them. If stones could travel these routes, so too could stories, and perhaps most importantly, so could the memories of extraordinary encounters with beings who came from beyond the world of ordinary human experience. The question that emerges from all this evidence is not whether contact existed between ancient Mesopotamia and ancient China, for the archaeological and genetic records make clear that some form of connection was maintained across the millennia. The question is, rather, what this contact means. For our understanding of the Anunnaki accounts, did the stories of sky beings originate in one location and spread outward along these ancient trade routes carried by travelers who shared tales around campfires under the vast Central Asian sky? Or did something more remarkable occur with both civilizations independently witnessing and recording the same phenomena, creating parallel testimonies that only now we are beginning to read? Together, the answers may lie in a discipline that few have thought to apply to this question: the comparative study of ancient languages. For words carry within them the fossilized remains of ancient beliefs and contacts. And when we examine the linguistic evidence connecting Sumerian and early Chinese, we enter a realm where the very sounds humans used to describe the divine may reveal connections hidden from other forms of inquiry. This is admittedly controversial territory for mainstream linguistics, has long held that the Sumerian language is an isolate, with no proven connections to any other known language. Family and Chinese, of course, belongs to the Sino-Tibetan family, with its own distinct origins and development. Yet a small number of scholars working at the margins of accepted academic discourse have noticed patterns that demand explanation. Similarities in how certain concepts are expressed that seem difficult to attribute to mere coincidence. Consider the ways in which both ancient traditions conceptualized heaven and the divine beings associated with it. The Sumerian word referred to both the sky and to the supreme deity associated with it, carrying within its single syllable the concept of that which is above the source of divine power. And authority in ancient Chinese, the word Tian similarly referred to heaven as both a physical location and a divine concept, the supreme force that granted legitimacy to earthly rulers and from which the ancestors and gods descended. The phonetic similarity may be superficial, but the conceptual parallel runs deep, suggesting either a shared inheritance from some more ancient source or contact that allowed these ideas to flow between cultures. More intriguing still are the comparisons some researchers have drawn between the structure of cuneiform writing and the early forms of Chinese characters. Both systems began as pictographic representations of concrete objects, and both evolved toward more abstract symbolic forms that could represent sounds and concepts. Both developed what linguists call determinatives or radicals that indicated the category to which a word belonged, whether it referred to a deity, a place, a type of material, or an action. The parallel development of these features could reflect universal tendencies in how human minds create writing systems, or it could reflect some form of contact or common inheritance that we do not yet fully understand. The names of divine beings present perhaps the most tantalizing possibilities for comparison, though we must approach these with appropriate caution, for the dangers of finding patterns where none exist are ever present in comparative linguistics. The Sumerian Enki, lord of the earth and god of wisdom, who brought knowledge to humanity, finds an echo in some scholars' view in the Chinese Fuxi, whose name carries associations with hidden knowledge and the fundamental patterns underlying reality. Both figures are credited with bringing the arts of civilization to humanity with teaching, writing, and divination, and with establishing the foundations of ordered society. Whether the similarity in their roles reflects the spread of stories along ancient trade routes, or whether both cultures were independently recording memories of the same being, remains an open question. But it is a question worth asking. The astronomical and mathematical knowledge of both civilizations presents another avenue of comparison for both the Sumerians and the ancient Chinese, developed sophisticated systems for tracking the movements of celestial bodies, and both attributed this knowledge to beings who came from the heavens. The Sumerian base 60 number system, which gave us our 60-minute hours and 360-degree circles, appears in modified form in certain Chinese astronomical calculations, and both cultures identified and named the same major constellations, though they told different stories about them. Language scholars suggest may preserve memory in ways that go beyond the mere recording of sounds. When two peoples separated by vast distances use similar expressions to describe similar sacred concepts. We are confronted with a mystery that demands explanation, and the explanation may lie not in the diffusion of stories from one culture to another, but in the common experience of both cultures with phenomena that left indelible marks on human memory. Now we arrive at the moment where all the threads we have followed must be woven together into a coherent pattern, for we have examined the Chinese texts with their accounts of beings who descended from heaven. We have studied the artifacts of Sanxingdui with their haunting bronze faces gazing upward toward the sky. We have traced the ancient routes along which people and ideas flowed between East and West, and we have listened for the echoes of shared language that might connect Sumerian and Chinese traditions. What emerges from this synthesis is a theory that challenges the very foundations of how we understand human history. The theory might be called the common source hypothesis, and it proposes something remarkable in its implications, that the Anunnaki accounts preserved in Sumerian tablets and the celestial being accounts preserved in Chinese texts are not separate mythologies that happen to develop similar themes, but rather parallel testimonies to the same historical events witnessed and recorded by different cultures in different parts of the world. If this hypothesis is correct, then the beings that Sumerians called Anunnaki were not a local Mesopotamian phenomenon limited to the region between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, but rather a global presence that interacted with human populations across the ancient world, from the ziggurats of Ur to the oracle bone workshops of Yinshu. These beings left their mark on every civilization they touched, and each civilization recorded these encounters according to its own cultural frameworks and linguistic traditions. The Chinese texts in this understanding do not merely confirm what the Sumerian tablets tell us. They complete the picture in crucial ways that the Mesopotamian records alone cannot provide. Consider what the Chinese sources add to our understanding of these beings. The Sumerian tablets focus heavily on the arrival of the Anunnaki and their activities during what might be called the establishment phase, when they were actively involved in human affairs. The Chinese texts, by contrast, preserve what appear to be more detailed accounts of the departure phase, describing how the celestial emperors returned to the heavens and the circumstances under which they withdrew from direct involvement in human governance. The accounts of Huangdi ascending on a dragon of light, the stories of the celestial bridges being withdrawn, the gradual transition from divine to human rule, all of these elements in Chinese tradition fill gaps that exist in the Sumerian record, where the departure of the gods is treated more briefly and with less detail. Furthermore, the Chinese texts offer a different perspective on the relationship between these beings and humanity, where the Sumerian accounts often emphasize the hierarchical and sometimes harsh nature of this relationship, depicting humans as servants created to labor for the gods. The Chinese traditions tend to emphasize the teaching and civilizing aspects, portraying the celestial beings more as tutors and guides than as masters. This difference may reflect cultural variations in how the same events were interpreted, or it may preserve different aspects of a complex relationship that no single cultural tradition fully captured. The technological descriptions in the Chinese texts also add dimensions absent from the Sumerian accounts. The detailed descriptions of flying vehicles in texts like the Huinanzi, the references to astronomical instruments and observation techniques in the records of the ancient astronomers, the accounts of medical and agricultural knowledge being transmitted from heaven to earth. All of these provide a more complete picture of what these beings allegedly brought to humanity than we find in the cuneiform tablets. Alone, the concept of distributed testimony becomes relevant here. A concept borrowed from legal theory, where multiple independent witnesses to the same event provide accounts that can be cross-referenced and compared when witnesses separated by distance and circumstance. Describe similar events with consistent core details but different peripheral features. This pattern suggests authentic memory rather than borrowed mythology. And this is precisely the pattern we observe when comparing Chinese and Sumerian accounts of beings from heaven. The core elements align: beings descended from the sky, brought knowledge to humanity, held positions of authority, and eventually departed. The peripheral elements differ, reflecting the different cultural contexts in which these memories were preserved and transmitted. If we are witnessing distributed testimony, then the implications are staggering. For it would mean that the Anunnaki, or whatever name we choose to call them, left evidence of their presence not merely in one corner of the ancient world, but across its entirety. And this would transform the Anunnaki question from a matter of interpreting Sumerian mythology to a matter of understanding a fundamental chapter in the story of human civilization itself. The Chinese texts have waited thousands of years for someone to read them. With these questions in mind, they have been studied as literature, as history, as philosophy, but rarely have they been examined as potential witnesses to the same phenomena recorded in the tablets of ancient Sumer. Now, as we learn to read them in this new light, they begin to speak with voices we never knew to listen, foretelling us of beings who came from heaven, who taught humanity the arts of civilization, and who left behind memories that persist across cultures and across millennia in the silence of the desert winds that blow across the ancient trade routes, in the faded ink of bamboo manuscripts, preserved in temple archives, in the bronze faces of Sanxingdui. Staring eternally upward, we find the traces of a story larger than any single culture could contain, a story that belongs not to Sumer alone, or to China alone, but to humanity as a whole. And so we arrive at the place where all journeys of discovery must eventually lead, not to a final answer, but to a new way of seeing, a transformed understanding of the landscape we thought we knew so well. The dawn is breaking now, soft light spreading across the horizon, and with it comes a moment of quiet reflection on everything we have encountered together in these hours of exploration. History, as we were taught it in classrooms and textbooks, is a map drawn in comfortable ignorance of vast territories that lay beyond the edges, territories that scholars and institutions preferred to leave blank rather than admit they did not understand. We are only now beginning to fill in those blank spaces, and what we are finding there challenges nearly everything we assumed about who we are and how we came to be. The oracle bones of Yinshu, the bronze faces of Sanxingdui, the celestial emperors of the bamboo annals, the strange beings catalogued in the Shanhai Jing. All of these pieces of evidence point toward a conclusion that mainstream archaeology has been reluctant to consider: that the Anunnaki accounts preserved in Sumerian clay were not isolated stories belonging to one culture alone, but were instead fragments of a much larger tapestry that stretched across the ancient world. To accept these connections is not to abandon reason as some critics would suggest. It is to apply reason more broadly, more courageously, and more honestly than we have been taught. The resistance to these ideas is understandable, for they challenge not merely academic theories, but deeply held assumptions about human uniqueness and independence, about our species having pulled itself up from primitive beginnings through our own genius alone. Yet the evidence continues to accumulate, and with each passing year, with each new excavation and each freshly translated text, the case for connection grows stronger. In universities across Asia, in research institutes in Europe and America, a new generation of scholars is beginning to ask the questions that their predecessors feared to voice. They are examining genetic data that reveals unexpected population movements in the ancient world, trade networks that connected East and West millennia before the Silk Road received its name, and textual parallels that seem too precise to be coincidental. These researchers work at the margins of their fields, often facing skepticism from colleagues, yet they persist because the evidence compels them forward. They understand that knowledge advances not through comfortable consensus, but through the courage to follow evidence wherever it leads, even when that destination unsettles everything we thought we knew. The philosophical implications of what we have explored tonight are profound, for if humanity was indeed a tutored species, if our ancestors received knowledge and guidance from beings more advanced than themselves, then our entire understanding of civilization must be reconsidered. We did not invent writing, mathematics, astronomy, and agriculture through slow trial and error alone. We were taught, we were lifted, we were given gifts that accelerated our development in ways that would otherwise have taken millennia. This does not diminish human achievement, but rather places it in a larger context, one in which we are not isolated wanderers in a silent universe, but participants in something far grander than we imagined. And the Chinese texts, these Eastern tablets that have waited so long to be read with fresh eyes, add their voice to a chorus that spans the entire globe. Every ancient culture, without exception, tells of beings who came from the sky, who taught humanity the arts of civilization, and who eventually departed with promises or warnings, or both. The Sumerians called them Anunnaki, those who from heaven came to earth. The Hebrews preserved memories of the Watchers, mysterious figures who descended to interact with humanity in the days before the Great Flood. The Babylonians remembered the Apkallu, 7 sages who emerged from the sea to teach wisdom to humankind. Across the ocean, the peoples of South America spoke of Viracocha, a tall, pale teacher who arrived from across the waters, shared knowledge of building and agriculture, and then departed with a promise to return. In India, the Vedic texts describe the Devas, celestial beings who interacted freely with humans in an earlier age. In Egypt, the Neteru were gods who walked among mortals, establishing the foundations of one of history's greatest civilizations. We have called these stories myths, and perhaps that word has allowed us to keep them at a comfortable distance, to appreciate them as cultural artifacts without taking them seriously as testimony. But myths do not arise from nothing. They are, at their core, attempts to preserve memory across generations, to encode in story form experiences that the original witnesses deemed too important to forget. When we find the same story told independently across cultures that had no known contact with one another, the cultures separated by oceans and continents and millennia, We must ask whether they are all inventing the same fiction or all remembering the same truth. The Chinese texts are not an isolated tradition speaking alone in the darkness. They are a chorus. They join voices that have been singing the same song since the dawn of civilization. And together, those voices tell us something that our modern minds have been taught to dismiss, but that our ancient hearts have never quite forgotten. We were visited, we were changed, and the visitors left traces everywhere, in tablets and temples, in pyramids and jade discs, in the very structure of our languages and the patterns of our stars. The night has deepened now, and the time has come to let these thoughts settle into silence, to allow the mind to rest and the deeper parts of consciousness to process what we have encountered together. We have traveled far tonight, from the torch-lit archives of ancient China to the wind-swept tells of Mesopotamia, from the mysterious pits of Sanxingdui to the theoretical highways that once connected East and West. We have examined evidence and weighed theories and allowed ourselves to wonder about possibilities that lie beyond the boundaries of conventional thought. But no single journey, however long, can bring us to final answers about questions this profound. We are still learning who we are and where we came from, still piecing together fragments of a story that began before writing existed to record it. Somewhere in the archives of China, in caves and temples and forgotten libraries, more tablets wait to be discovered. More oracle bones lie buried in fields that farmers walk across without knowing what rests beneath their feet. More bronze faces stare upward in sealed pits, their enormous eyes still watching for the return of those they were made to honor. They have been patient for millennia. They will wait a little longer. And perhaps that patience is itself a lesson for us, a reminder that truth does not demand to be discovered on any particular schedule, that it simply waits for those who are ready to receive it. The stars are emerging now in the darkness overhead, the same stars that ancient astronomers mapped onto jade discs thousands of years ago, the same stars that Sumerian priests watched from their ziggurats, calculating the movements of planets they had been taught to track by teachers from beyond this world. Those stars do not care about our theories or our doubts or our academic controversies. They simply shine, as they have shone for billions of years, witnesses to everything that has ever happened on this small planet below. And as sleep approaches and consciousness softens into that gentle threshold between waking and dream, perhaps we can touch for just a moment the edge of the truth that our ancestors knew, the truth they carved into bone and cast in bronze and wrote on bamboo strips that they buried in tombs so that future generations would find them and remember. We are not alone. We have never been alone. The sky has always been watching, and somewhere in its depths, the teachers who first lifted humanity from ignorance may be watching still, waiting to see what we will become, waiting to see if we will remember. Let the silence hold you now. Let the distant temple bells fade into the stillness. Let the questions rest, unanswered but alive, seeds planted in fertile ground that will continue to grow long after this night has passed. The mystery remains, and that is not a failure but a gift. For mystery is what calls us forward, what keeps us searching, what reminds us that the universe is larger and stranger and more wonderful than we have yet dared to believe. Sleep well and carry these ancient whispers with you into your dreams, where perhaps the boundaries between past and present grow thin, and the voices of those who came before can still be heard by those who know how to listen.